Hello and welcome to the August 23rd edition of Ukraine Without Hype. I'm Anthony Bardaway here with Romeo Kursk.
Hey, folks.
We have had a busy August, so this is going to be another news update before another special topics next week.
Anthony, that can't be right. Nothing ever happens in August.
I remember when August was always the quiet month in Ukraine, when everyone was off on vacation, including the government, and quite literally nothing happened. But these are not those times.
Nothing ever happened, bros. Stay losing.
Before we go on, I would like to ask you to go to our Patreon page at patreon.com/Ukraine Without Hype and join our supporters. You can join onto our Discord channel and be alerted about new episodes, episode ideas, that sort of thing. And before we get into a lot of very serious things, I'll do a good lead-in of what I was up to this week. So last weekend, I was able to go to the Rugby Sevens tournament in Kiev. So there are two basic types of rugby. There's the full kind that has 15 players on a team and 7 on a team variety called sevens. Sevens are what you play during the summer season. It's taken a bit less seriously and more recreational. And I was able to go to the Rugby Sevens tournament at Spartak Stadium, which is always interesting to me because Spartak is a very Soviet name for sporting things because the Soviets and communists really love the history of Spartacus, slave revolt against the masters and all that. But I don't think anyone's ever going to decommunize Spartak. But anyway. This was a tournament between the teams from many different cities in Ukraine. Not many spectators. Ukraine is not a huge rugby country. It's not New Zealand or France or even Georgia. Georgia's pretty big into rugby. So most of the people in the stands were the family members of the other teams. But as I was watching, it turned out that the best rugby team available is apparently Kharkiv. As I was watching, when I first saw them, Kharkiv was the ones with the best designed uniforms, and if you've ever seen the movie Mighty Ducks, you know that whoever has the best uniforms is obviously the best team, and lo and behold, they ended up winning. I really want to get the Kharkiv rugby kit. It's really cool looking. I need to grab that somehow. I don't know if they sell it. It was a good day out. The Rugby Sevens games go pretty quickly, and this is the first time I've seen a live sporting event since the start of the war. So that was fun. I kind of want to get out to maybe Lviv, where football is a bit more played more often. I don't know.
Vinnytsia used to have a American football team, the River City Boys.
Yeah, there's a few football teams in Kiev. The main one is, I believe, called the Patriots or something like that. I remember going to a fundraiser they did one time, but only because it was at a barbecue restaurant that's close to me. With everything else in Ukraine, the war loomed over it. In between games, videos played of various rugby players who had gone off to the front, then many of them who have been killed. You could probably guess that people who play rugby are a bit more of the aggressive sort, so obviously sorted themselves into more forward units and took therefore higher casualties than the population as a whole. There are a lot of soldiers at the game, quite a few people who were amputees at the game in uniform. So it's just a reminder of really nothing you can do in Ukraine escapes the shadow of the war. It touches and affects everything. They had fundraisers there for it and everything, so can't escape it. Anyway, anything going on in your life this week, Romeo?
No, not especially. Not especially. A water main broke in Vinnytsia and it was fixed in a day. Honestly, the speed of which utilities gets fixed has honestly improved over the course of the war. It used to be if like a water main or something broke, it would take the city a couple of days for someone to fix it. This stuff gets fixed within 24 hours now, which is pretty impressive considering. That wasn't even like war damage. It just, shitty old Soviet infrastructure.
Yeah, they just replaced the pipes in front of my apartment. And they did it surprisingly quickly. The road was only shut down for a couple of weeks. But with that light talk out of the way, moving on to the actual news. And now I'll start with the combat update, and this will focus on Pokrovsk and New York. Pokrovsk, the Russians have continued to make progress. At this point, they have hit the Kazeny Torets/Zhurivka River. It seems to have two names before changing at one lake. They are mostly still on the southeast side of this river. There are several villages they are storming to try and cross it, but they have been doing that for several days, and in that direction they have slowed down because they have met this natural and fortified barrier. This is the direction that Rodovka is in, that town that I keep bringing up. They have not been able to reach Rodovka further than since our last update. That is where the main focus of the fighting continues to be, in that direction, because it is the most straight line to Pokrovsk. However, because they have reached that barrier going westwards, they have also started to turn southwards from that salient to try and take the M04 highway. That M04 highway has been in range of their attacks for quite a while now, so it isn't especially useful anymore. But if the Russians are able to cut that highway, then the Ukrainian defenses to the southeast of it that have been using it for supply. And again, I don't even know how much it can be used for supply for the past few weeks. A lot of that will likely fall as well. The town of Pokrovsk, the authorities have given the orders to evacuate. This is a town that had a pre-war population of 60,000 people. Many of them had fled, but many of them had stayed because up until very recently, it was not immediately in the Russian warpath. The fall of Avdiivka and the rapid advance outside of it, or rapid by the standards of the war anyway, have caught a lot of people off guard, leading to a very chaotic evacuation in that direction. However, hundreds of people are leaving every day. The directive is that it will no longer be safe to do so within the next 2 weeks. They don't have much time, according to the government, and they are taking advantage of that. Evacuations are difficult, but it seems to be going in a much more systemic way in Pokrovsk than in many other areas, partially because of the size of the city and its importance to the defenders, to the government, to the army. They will hold Pokrovsk as well as they can, but they obviously do not want civilians there getting in the way of themselves or taking direct hits from the Russian army as their artillery inches ever closer. As a humanitarian disaster, saw some videos of just packing kids into buses with child-sized body armor that, tugged at some heartstrings there, of like this bright orange body armor that you can put on kids that are used for this. But it is good to see that this is an organized effort to evacuate the city. There have been some finger pointings of how this section has deteriorated so quickly. And there was an article in Associated Press where some local commanders were blaming the low quality of conscripts that are sent to their units. I'll start by saying that there have been many cases in this war of journalists talking to local commanders and letting them just kind of bitch, basically, just kind of complain, and taking that as gospel truth and causing a lot of disruption because of that without proper checking or finding counter narratives. And I think there's a little bit of both there. A lot of the quotes in the AP article specifically sounded like it was just crusty old soldiers complaining. Though, of course, there is the issue of any new conscript obviously not being as high of quality as a soldier who volunteered at the start of the war, who was much more gung-ho about being a part of an infantry unit.
Like, I'll say this, having read the article as well, I don't doubt that a lot of their complaints are accurate in terms of their perspective. And I don't doubt that a lot of the new recruits, especially that have been sent to infantry to Pokrovsk, have not received the proper training, have not received the proper equipment, because, well, there have been enough reports and stories about how poorly the Ukrainian conscription system works that I think it's insane to dismiss these allegations out of hand. However, quite frankly, it is idiotic to expect conscripts, not contract soldiers or volunteers, but conscripts, to hold positions that they know little about, with little guidance and poor equipment, And when they're under heavy threat, that is purely the job of the leadership to convince these conscripts. Like, what are conscripts? They're just dudes. They're regular people who 2 or 3 weeks ago were working as electricians or were warehouse workers or like normal guys. These are not trained professional combat ready men. You cannot expect them to perform heroically if command does not inspire them and lead them to perform heroically. And if you need a heroic defense, don't use conscripts. It's real simple.
And one specific complaint that they have been making was that conscripts retreat sooner and don't hold up to artillery. That is definitely a leadership problem. We had talked a few weeks ago about an encirclement that took place in the Pokrovsk direction that the command refused to retreat out of until the lower ranked officers basically forced the issue and said, we are making a fighting withdrawal, whether you like it or not, deal with it. And we've heard many stories of poor leadership in the Pokrovsk direction by battalion and brigade commanders. And if soldiers know that you're not going to allow a retreat when a retreat has to happen, they may take things into their own hands. So that's a leadership problem, not a soldier problem.
And again, this would be a different story if we were talking about professional contract soldiers who were breaking, but the article keeps harping on and all the complaints keep harping on conscripts, which I just find infuriating considering A, the conscription system, and B, these are normal people. Imagine your father, your uncle, your brother, like, gets shipped off to war. Yeah, they're not going to function as well as a trained contract soldier who actively chose being in the military as their career, has been in the military for a long time, or has had previous military experience. What do you expect from these people? If you want them to perform better, you have to lead them better. You have to train them better. You have to equip them better. Like, it's on the command. It is never, ever on the conscript, because the conscript cannot help be anything but a civilian 3 weeks ago.
And who gives the order to build defenses and where? The commanders. So if they don't have the defenses to stand up to artillery, then still the commanders. There needs to be a serious look into who is actually running these units down there. And it's all a trade-off because the better commanders have been sent to the Kursk offensive. We'll be talking about that in a minute, but all trade-offs have to happen, and the resources have been put elsewhere besides Pokrovsk, and what's left there is not as high quality of leadership. And that has led to the situation where both Ukraine and Russia are making advances, and often for the same reasons. Ukraine is making advances in the Kursk offensive into Russia because they are being met by Russian conscripts with poor leadership and are using their good soldiers to attack them. So the Russian defenses there are collapsing one after the other. Kursk, Russia is attacking poorly led conscripts, and again, they are not holding up to the assault. It's going in both directions right now for very similar reasons. But before we get into Kursk, I'll talk about the town of New York. And we got some feedback from previous episodes. Wait, what? Is it called New York? Yes, it's called New York. No one really knows where the name of this town comes from. It goes back into Cossack times. There are debates of the etymology. It's not necessarily named after the New York, but it was definitely used throughout its history as branding purposes. And that is kind of why New York is giving more attention than some other towns in the Donbass, because it does have that charisma to it, when in many other ways it's very, very similar to any other town in Donbass. One thing that's special about it is, like I've been saying last episode, is that it was the one part of the front line that the Russians had not been able to advance on until extremely recently. Everywhere else on the combat maps, there would be changes. You'd see where the Russians had advanced, except for this one stretch of a few kilometers next to New York, where not only was everything the same, but Ukrainians were able to launch raids into previously Russian-occupied territory from 2014-2015. So that's its importance to the war effort. But culturally, I think it's also very important. So like I said, the name goes back to who knows when and by who knows who, other than it just being another Cossack village in the Donbass region. It was then later settled by German Mennonites in the 19th century, a religious group of Germans that were invited into the Russian Empire because they were seen as like good Protestant work ethic types.
Basically, not lazy alcoholic Slavs, but, sober and hardworking Germans.
Yeah, and learning about the German Mennonites in Ukraine, that's a whole topic we can get into, especially since the Mennonites in the U.S., they're the people who look like the Amish but wear like yellow dresses instead of black ones.
Yeah, Anthony, you're gonna have to at some point break down exactly the differences.
It's not. I don't know. They're Amish adjacent, but not really. A lot of Mennonites will probably take offense to that, but their history in the U.S. is very, very different from in Ukraine, because in the U.S. they are these, the rural farmers who you go to make furniture. That's kind of what they're known for in the Midwest, is their craftsmanship. In Ukraine, for like a solid century under the Russian Empire, they were kind of invited to be landlords. So in this huge stretch of eastern Ukraine, in between about Zaporizhia, which also had a bunch of Mennonites, and Donbass, there's all these Mennonite towns where they would own the local mill or something. This played into the revolution. I'm going to stop myself before getting too much of a rant, but this was one of those towns where the Mennonites were. And they did not fare well during the revolution, is a light way to put it. Many of them had supported the White Army and the Tsar during the Civil War period, so they did not survive that very well. And then during World War II, Stalin did not like having ethnic Germans around, so they suffered from that as well. But under Soviet times, they communized the name, by which they basically just meant make it not called New York anymore because that's American, and changed it to Novhorodsk. And for much of Soviet times did not have much of a profile. The town became much more prominent in the post-Maidan period. A set of local cultural activists, along with several other kind of national level Ukrainian activists, such as Victoria Emelina, who was one of the major figures in here. We've talked about her in many episodes, the journalist and cultural activist who was murdered by the Russians within a missile strike. She was a major figure in raising the cultural profile of New York. And it was part of a broader cultural revival of the Donbass region in general. Really. A lot of this was happening in Mariupol, although that is destroyed as well, of bringing a lot of artists, concerts, like artists in residence programs, translators, and making Donbass much more culturally interconnected with Ukraine as a whole, and then getting that out to the world. And what better place than that than a place called New York? You already have the name there. You can kind of play around with that. So one of the things they had there was the New York Literary Festival, an annual book festival about Ukrainian authors that really focused on the local culture of Donbass. There's also the New York Marathon, where they said, like, you can kind of virtually follow a marathon route in our town of New York. And just to remind people that the war is still happening. If you were to run a marathon distance from New York, you'd end up in Russian occupied territory. It's right there. During this whole period where a lot of the world was ignoring that Russia was occupying Ukraine, New York wanted to remind the world that war was still happening. Well, the world finally got the message of New York in 2022, and they ended up on the front line and have been taking very heavy damage since then. The town has wiped out, more or less, this kind of symbol of Ukrainian cultural revival at Donbass, that Russia could not let that stand. And now it's no more. One more town in the Donbass that no longer exists because Russia came to liberate it. The combat update here is that the fighting has been going on in New York for the past several weeks, of Russia taking more and more of the town, although the fall was quite rapid, all things considered. And while the Ukrainian military still claims that part of the town is still a gray zone, a contested area, it is more or less done with. There's nothing more to this city. If we look north of it, it's the larger town that's adjacent to Toretsk. The Russians have advanced into the outlying areas of Toretsk and not have been able to push much further than that, but are going to take that eventually as well, probably at the rate that this is going. So, New York, small town, not much different from any other around it, but because it represented something important about Ukraine, I think. Not only do we have to pay attention to it and its legacy, but the Russians definitely paid attention to why they had to destroy it. Moving on to the other section of the front that is going much better for Ukraine. We kind of front loaded you there with a lot of depressing things. Now, for the flip side of that, the Ukrainian incursion into the Kursk Oblast, which is really looking like it is in there for the long haul, including some reports. Apparently, even the Russian media has been directed to talk about this as kind of a natural disaster that they're just going to have to live with for a while.
An earthquake of Ukrainians.
So our combat update here is that the Ukrainian advance has continued to be quite rapid for the reasons I had just described when talking about Pokrovsk. They are hitting a lot of conscripts and those crazy Chechen Keturovtsi who are really bad fighters but are taking full advantage of this time to do some media, which is strange to me because what's actually happening is I'm just being captured a lot. But anyway, the battlefield as it is shaping out in the Kursk region is that Ukraine continues to spread out largely along the Russian border, taking more and more Russian border territory. The advances towards the city of Kursk have slowed down a lot, though there is one town, Malaya Lokna, where there was a cauldron where a lot of Russians were captured or killed. And that is in the direction of Kursk. So it's not as though there's no advances being made, just not as quickly as in the other directions there. The main effort right now seems to be isolating all the Russians to the south of the same river. Ukraine has destroyed all bridges along this river, and the pontoon bridges that are being put up are also being targeted very quickly after they are put up. This is leaving many Russian soldiers between the river and the Ukrainian border cut off and in disarray. What I assume is going to happen is that once they are fully and properly isolated after a few more towns along the riverbanks are taken, they will be easier hunting for Ukraine in that area. We've already seen videos of Russian soldiers trying to covertly escape this area, being guided out by some more senior soldiers and in just utter chaos. It's not as though there's no way to escape this river. It's not that big. You can swim it, but if you have tanks, armored personnel carriers, or even want to do anything in a full military way, grabbing a raft or just doing the breaststroke cross is not going to cut it as far as a tactical retreat. Similarly, a lot of other pockets are forming where Russians are being cut off. This is an extremely successful operation going on right now with, again, some of Ukraine's best forces. We have also seen a lot of international fighters seeing the independent Chechnya flag flying over Russian territory probably does something psychologically to the other side. I don't know. The Georgians are taking part, and for a Georgian to be able to invade Russia, again, huge morale boost. Like we were talking about last week, so we're not going to get as much into it this week, but it continues to be very heartening all around. But what is happening now is also Ukraine is forming an occupation authority there because they now control a portion of Russia, and that means they have to govern it. That's what the rules are. So, Romeo, how is this Ukrainian occupation authority shaping out?
So, yeah, now that we're, pretty clearly in Kursk for at least the medium term, we can see that this isn't a raid. There is no massive Russian secret army coming to sweep all the Ukrainians away. It's just another front in the war. Yeah, you have to, govern the territory you occupy. So Ukraine has finally chosen a commanding officer, a military commandant for the occupied Kursk territories, one Major General Eduard Moskalyov. And folks, when I heard that name, I laughed for a good 5 minutes. Anthony backed me up because a slur, I guess, for Ukrainians against Russians is Moskal or Muscovite, basically. This guy's last name is literally Muscovite. He is General Eddie the Muscovite, which I have no special insight into how military command decisions are made. But I'm incredibly skeptical that Eddie the Muscovite was chosen purely on merit. Now, in terms of his background, he did command the Joint Forces Operation, aka the Donbass Front, basically before the full-scale invasion, for almost a year there. He's held other like top positions in the Ukrainian military. Like, not to say that this guy isn't qualified, but they specifically chose a guy named Eddie the Muscovite to be the occupying commander of Ukrainian occupied Russia. So it's hard for me to see that as anything but, I don't know, a troll, a tease. The Ukrainian command has not been above doing that to the Russians, tweaking their noses a bit, but less interesting than the actual military commander, because let's be honest, like, the policies are not going to be set by him. The policies are set in Kyiv. And so far, Ukraine has gone out of its way to, at least on media, to show a very stark difference in how the Ukrainians occupy territory versus the Russians. We all know the consequences of Russian occupation, the arbitrary killings, the random arrests, the so-called filtration camps, you know, the massacres, the atrocities, the tortures, et cetera, et cetera. On the other hand, the Ukrainian authorities have been very publicly handing out aid, and not just the sort of made-for-TV propaganda that the Russians did, for example, in Kherson, where they would, like, film themselves giving out bottles of water or whatever. A lot of these aid distribution videos that soldiers in Kursk Oblast are sharing look basically identical to dozens of other aid distribution videos that they've recorded in Ukraine. They go in, and again, everyone speaks the same language, especially this close to the Ukrainian border. Everyone speaks more or less Surzik, the kind of a local dialectic blend of Russian Ukrainian. And they just go in. There's a video I saw the other day where just a bunch of soldiers go into some old lady's garden and hand her a bunch of water and say, look, we can't like stick around, but just make sure your neighbors get this stuff. And she was like, oh, I can keep it. They're like, yeah, just, you know, make sure that people who need the stuff get it. So and again, this is an occupied territory. There is not a lot of quote unquote free media there. But from what we can see, Ukrainians are acting like people when they come into these areas. And mind you, the part of Russia that is occupied is some of the most ignored and poorly developed parts of Russia in general. A lot of these towns and villages don't have any municipal infrastructure, not even running water. Maybe if they're lucky, they'll have a gas line, and that's like a pretty big thing. Like, a lot of these places are just not developed at all, to the extent that it is surprising to Ukrainians. Like, I've been to a lot of middle of nowhere Ukrainian villages, and like literally middle of nowhere, the middle of Kropyvnytsky Oblast, like deep in the mountains, really places that are hours away from anything. And even those places will at the very least have power and gas, which a lot of these places in Russia do not. And a lot of the Ukrainian soldiers have been reported being surprised at just how dilapidated and poor these villages that they're liberating are. And it seems like the locals are also not too bothered by this. There is, so far as we can see, and I'm sure this will change in the future, but so far there's been no partisan activity. Locals have not been taking up arms, staging protests, like all the things that the world saw Ukrainian civilians do when villages in Kyiv Oblast were getting occupied, when the Russians were assaulting from every position. You had spontaneously growing like partisan movements. There's not a hint of that. The Russians do not care. When you're that poor, it is really probably academic which flag flies over your dilapidated village council building. It doesn't matter. And on top of that, the Ukrainians are really trying to establish themselves as good hosts, I guess. There was one video with a well-known Ukrainian, it's a bit of a stretch to call him a journalist, but let's say media figure, Yuri Butusov, who...
I like Yuri Butusov a bit more than you do.
I'm not against Butusov, but...
He's a character. I don't
have anything against Butusov personally, but he's not really quite a journalist. But Butusov was allowed to embed with one of the units that went into, so far, the biggest town that is under Ukrainian control in Kursk Oblast, this place called Sucha. And he filmed himself going into a local prosecutor's office and finding a box of files that he says were for draft dodging cases. And then he filmed himself saying, hey, look, I found a bunch of good Russians and let's make sure they don't get retaliated against. So he went ahead and took that case of documents of these case files against draft dodgers and just set them ablaze. Which again, we know how the Russians have treated collaborators in areas that were about to be liberated by Ukraine. And those collaborators were lucky if they were allowed to evacuate with the rest of the Russian occupational authorities when they fled. So all in all, and again, I constantly have to preface this, that we do not have free media access to Kursk Oblast. This is a military occupied area. However, from what we have observed so far, it really does seem like the Ukrainians are going out of their way to draw this very strong distinction between what it means to be under Ukrainian occupation and what it means to be under Russian occupation.
Yeah, it's a very, very deliberate point that they are making. Yes, they are following the law in how they are doing this. They're holding to their international obligations as an occupying force, but at the same time, it's very important that they show that they are better than Russia.
And honestly, given the state of just even Russian civilian administration, it's not a high bar to clear. It really isn't. The Russian government does not consider Russian citizens to be fully human. There is a very clear hierarchy of citizenship in the Russian Federation, and these people who live in these Ukrainian border territories where there is no significant industry, there is no significant resources, are very much, and they know this, these people are very much at the bottom of the totem pole in Russia. So again, treating them better is not that difficult.
The next topic we can talk about with Kursk is the Ukrainians did not tell a lot of people in Ukraine that they're about to do this. That makes sense. But very importantly, there have been multiple news sources on all types reporting the same thing right now. Ukraine did not tell the Americans anything about what they were about to do when they were planning this.
There's been a long history throughout the past 3 years of this war of Americans leaking Ukrainian battle plans, either directly to Russia in terms of actual spies, and through just really poor operational security. There have been congressional aides with classified battle plans that have just washed up in a cab somewhere and then gets posted online. There have been times when the American military has taken it upon itself to warn its Russian counterparts of planned Ukrainian attacks when the United States deemed that this or that plan would be, in their belief, escalatory. It's not surprising that Ukraine has taken these incidents to heart.
You also just have to look at the counteroffensive of last summer that was talked about for months and months beforehand. The Americans were micromanaging every aspect of the buildup to it. They were saying what would be allowed, what would not be allowed, what kind of equipment you are getting on what schedule. If we look at a lot of other things involving missile strikes against Russia, they're withholding what Ukraine is allowed to do. And Ukraine learned from all this that it's better for the Americans not to have the chance to micromanage. If they had known about this offensive beforehand, they probably would have said no. They probably would have said this is crossing the red line. We are afraid of you getting close to the Kursk nuclear power plant. We are afraid of the rally around the flag moment in Russia, which, by the way, is nonsense. The Russians not only don't care about Kursk, so there's not going to be a rally around the flag that way, but also public opinion in Russia does not matter. Nothing changes it in either direction there. They are all for the invasion. They're not going to suddenly become even more for the invasion in a meaningful way because of this. But not giving the Americans the opportunity to overthink it, to micromanage it, to draw their red lines and red tape and everything else, it's for the best.
Yeah, quite frankly, the United States has not done the best job in this war. The civilian advisors have continuously spread, if not outright Russian narratives, ideas and concepts that are only helpful to Russia. The US military has been slow in fulfilling its obligations. I'm speaking purely of the things that they control, things like delivery schedules and so on, that the military has leeway to set. And again, the micromanagement, like the control over not only what equipment is used, but what the units that use that equipment should and should not be doing. Simply an insane amount of interference. I'm glad that we stopped paying attention to the Americans. And it seems like the White House has decided to not retaliate against Ukraine. There were, at the beginning of the Kursk offensive, Biden's first statements was that there was going to be some kind of reassessment in terms of aid. That doesn't seem to have happened, or if it's happening behind closed doors and very slowly, which obviously is good for us. And aid is still flowing in. There haven't been any reported changes in that front. So as it really seems like the White House has shrugged and said, well, they've done it. We don't like it, but they've done it. And that's fine. We can't control that, which, yes, once again, the US government does not control Zelensky. Ukraine is very much a sovereign state. That is, in essence, the entire point of the full-scale invasion.
And overall, the lesson from international politics that we can learn from Russia, that we can learn from Israel, that we can learn from the Americans themselves is that if you just do something, other people have to react to it. And often the reaction to it will have to take your own actions into consideration and balance out what you're doing. Whereas if you're just asking for permission and making demands and all that prior to do anything, you can be told no. You can be told to scale back your ambitions, to not do this or that. But if you just do it and other people have to react, it will turn out better for you in the long run, which is probably not the best lesson for people to learn, but it's one that Ukraine has to take to heart. And then the last thing that we have to say about the Kursk offensive is that there has been some opening up of journalists to get into occupied Russia. There have been people from CNN, but mostly the big hitters or the people who are more attached to Ukrainian society for now. But Russia is issuing arrest warrants to these journalists for quote unquote illegally entering Russian territory. This makes sense. From a legal perspective, they are entering Russia without going through customs. That's against the law, against Russian law. Just as people who went into Crimea without Ukrainian permission during the long period of Crimean occupation without the full-scale war, a lot of the time people were held to account for that legally because that's entering Ukraine without going through Ukrainian border customs.
I know there have been a number of Western journalists who were banned from Ukraine, even though they claimed they were not pro-Russian, but they were banned from Ukraine because they had entered Crimea illegally via Russian territory, not Ukrainian territory.
Yeah, it's to be expected. But like we brought up last week, why does this not apply to the other quote unquote new territories of Russia? I've been to the new territories. I've been to Kherson. I've been to Zaporizhia. I have illegally entered Russia, but Russia does not care. What's the difference? These are not really Russia. They know it. We know it. Everyone knows it. It's all a big shell game that they're just pretending to be true. But once that illusion is pushed up against, there's nothing holding it up. So yeah, this kind of, like we were talking about last week, and we'll continue to talk about in the future, this puts a lie to everything Russia says about its so-called annexations. And moving on to our next topic, referring to an update to the Nordstream situation. So the Nordstream pipelines, there was two of them, Nord Stream 1 and Nord Stream 2. I'll get into the background of this first, but we don't often talk about Nord Stream. This was a pipeline that was destroyed by somebody in September of 2024 in the first year of the war, and there has been a lot of speculation and investigations of what happened since then. The development of Nord Stream 1 took quite a while. The initial concept came from the 90s. The deals were signed largely in 2005, and then they came online in 2011. was meant to take natural gas directly from Russia to Germany. There are many other land-based pipelines, including pipelines that run through Ukraine. However, there were some business disputes, we can say, between especially Ukraine and Russia on the transit of that gas. And so they wanted a direct route from Russia to Germany. Gerhard Schroeder, the Chancellor of Germany at the time, was the one who made the decision to sign most of these contracts. And then, immediately after leaving office, he stepped right into being a Russian gas oligarch himself. So the Chancellor of Germany, who made these decisions to have a gas pipeline, was rewarded for his political behaviors by becoming a fabulously wealthy board member on not only the Nordstream company, but also Gazprom and Rosneft.
Mind you, the Russians don't give you a golden ticket to their two most profitable national industries because they think you're a good person and you deserve it. That is just not how anything works.
This was one of the most obvious cases of corruption that I have ever seen. It was so blatant for the head of a country to do the thing of, in DC, there is the issue of people doing the lobbyist conveyor belt of going between the private sector lobbying and working for government directly. But for the leader of the head of government to then directly become a board member for the deal that he just made as a politician, usually there's a cooling off period of when you can go from being a member of government to being a lobbyist, but that's not necessary here. Obvious quid pro quo there. And ever since then, there had been many complaints raised by especially Baltic Europe, but also the rest of Eastern Europe, about why building this pipeline was a bad idea. Environmentally, it was a problem. Pipelines are always going to raise environmental concerns. We see this all the time, but also politically. The fact that Russia had to transfer its gas through other countries before it could be sold elsewhere was seen as a constraining factor on Russian aggression and political activity. There was only so much Russia could mess with Ukraine so long as it relied on Ukraine to sell its primary export to the rest of Europe. So all the countries that bordered Russia said, we would very much like it if we had veto points along the way and ways to affect Russian policy that Nord Stream would negate. And this obviously turned out to be the case. And the other obvious corruption here, and where the other obvious Russian pressure point here, is that the CEO of the Nord Stream company, Matthias Warnig, was a former Stasi agent, a member of the East German secret police. Now, there is a lot of former Stasi agents running around, but keep in mind here that Vladimir Putin in Soviet times was a Stasi liaison. He was a KGB secret policeman who was sent to Dresden to communicate between the Soviet secret police and the East German secret police. So here is a former East German secret policeman being raised up to the most important economic connection between Germany and Russia. So after this brilliant set of political decisions, the Germans decided that they needed another pipeline, Nord Stream 2. This was a long development. This was more into my career as a journalist, and I remember going over again and again all the various problems caused by Nord Stream 2, of this or that country raising concerns about it, raising environmental problems, regulatory problems that they were just blowing past entirely.
The EU, on multiple occasions, noted how the Nord Stream AG, the holding company for Nord Stream, never divested itself under EU regulations. Under EU regulations, basically, the provider of a resource cannot be the same person as the distributor. That is, a company that dredges for oil cannot be the same company that owns the pipelines that the oil flows through. Under EU regs, these have to be separate bodies. When Ukraine was integrating, one of the conditions for Ukrainian integration into the European Union, which was fulfilled, was the spinning off of the distribution entities in Ukraine's national fossil fuel company, Naftogaz, from Naftogaz itself. So Naftogaz is concerned only with extraction, and then new companies were formed for the actual like pipeline and maintenance and so on. That never happened with Nordstream. Rosneft and Gazprom own significant stakes that do not clear EU regulatory standards for this kind of spinning off for these entities to become similar, on top of the whole other host of problems. Nord Stream never fully completed all of the necessary environmental checks. They never received proper permission from a lot of the neighboring governments in the North Sea for some of this. They would just build through it. And then I believe it was Denmark that would complain and say, hey, these are Danish waters. No one cared. Nord Stream didn't care. The EU was prevented by Germany from pursuing any of these things. It was even more obviously corrupt and forced through than even Nord Stream 1.
And this whole time, of course, the Eastern Europeans were saying that this would be used as a tool of Russian blackmail on Europe, which turned out to be the case. As Russia was building up its forces for the full-scale invasion, Gazprom turned off the nozzle of Nord Stream 1 in September of 2021. They were saying this was for maintenance purposes. However, what was the actual effect was that it led to a dwindling of gas reserves in Germany during the winter as Russia was building up for this invasion, meaning that they were expecting Germany to be much more desperate for Russian gas when the invasion took place and therefore less likely to do anything to upset Russia. I think this was a good calculation to make. Germany has a long history of being very Russia understanding. However, it turned out not to be completely the case because Germany then became one of Ukraine's largest financial supporters, even if that has been a fraught relationship in many ways.
I'll say the Russian calculation was wrong because the Germans don't really need Russian gas for heating as much as the German industrial heartland in the Rhine. So the German industrial heartland, the Ruhr, the home of all of the German manufacturing and engineering that Germany is famous for. They're the ones really who needed it, not so much the people. The government is plenty rich and Germans have plenty of other ways of accessing enough heating for their citizens. They were never at risk of really losing any of that. It was, of course, as it so often is, a business-driven decision. The lack of cheap gas, German economic planners feared, would lead to a recession in Germany as all of these industries would no longer be able to access cheap gas. Of course, again, this was not the case because it turns out their needs were filled by American supplies, or an LNG, liquid natural gas, from the United States. So Russia really did miscalculate here with their efforts.
Yeah, Germany was very quickly able to reformat its economy in a really spectacular way. We have to give it to them for that. This brings us to late 2021, and the state of play is that Nord Stream 2 had been completed, but never opened yet. It was scheduled for opening in the next year, and Nord Stream 1 was closed off for quote-unquote maintenance, so nothing was going through here at the time. And this was seen as more of a diplomatic victory from everything. A lot of these Eastern Europeans who never wanted this pipeline to exist in the first place were seeing it being taken out of commission. Until the next we hear of it is September 26, 2022, when somebody blew it up. Don't know who, don't know when precisely this was planned or where or in whose halls the order was given, but it was blown up. And so again, September 26, 2022. This was followed by a lot of theories of who did it. There was a lot of speculation that Russia did it. There was suspicious Russian shipping activity in the area at the time, leading to some people to think that they blew it up. The Ukrainian stance is that Russia blew it up because they were the ones with the means, motive, and opportunity to do so. It's not easy to pull off blowing up an underwater pipeline. There are also conspiracy theories that the USA did it. There is a famous report by Seymour Hersh that made this claim, referring to some CIA or somebody in Washington making the decision to blow up the pipeline and sending American special forces to either do it or support a Ukrainian team in doing it.
Yeah, fun story about Hersh's reporting. There were very obvious fingerprints that he was fed that story by Russian intelligence agents, including in his reporting using purely Russian idioms translated into English.
Yeah, it was very absurd. Like there are these There are these little phrases in there that, like, no one says that in English. Why is Seymour Hersh saying that? Like, oh, it's because that's just a phrase that people use in Russia that was directly translated into English that somehow found their way into Hersh's mouth. So not very subtle there. Not a good report. This is, of course, the version that Russia prefers to use because they prefer to see the US or Britain as the hand behind everything.
Perfidious Albion.
Of course, and Ukraine can't do anything themselves, so they couldn't have done it. Although there was a little statement from Biden that could have backed up this paranoia by him saying, quote, if Russia invades Ukraine again, there'll be no longer a Nord Stream 2. We'll bring an end to it. I promise you we'll be able to do it. I'm pretty sure that just refers to diplomatically that Germany would not be able to continue its blatantly illegal pipeline if this additional political layer of a Russian invasion is layered on top of it. But that was taken to, we'll blow it up.
Given how resilient the U.S. has been in allowing Ukraine to even strike airfields with U.S. provided arms, it is incredibly doubtful that the Biden administration would okay an operation to blow up a pipeline heavily favored by one of its closest European allies.
Yeah, that doesn't seem so likely. And then there was the third option that Ukraine did it. And most of this was based around a boat called the Andromeda that was in the area. It was owned by a Ukrainian, and there was theories that this yacht was the launching point for the sabotage. And there have been all these reports since 2022 of offering evidence for one version of these events.
I saw one allegation that the Norwegians did it.
There's been a million stories, and we've never felt the need to cover any of them. But this update here seems to be something much more concrete and much more interesting in the way that the international community has responded to it. There was a Wall Street Journal article alleging that Germany had issued the arrest for someone named, hold on here, Volodymyr Z, that he was a diving instructor living in Poland who carried out the sabotage. Now, Volodymyr Z apparently had this arrest warrant carried out against him, and that the authorities in Poland went and searched his home, but he wasn't there because by that time he had already escaped to Ukraine. Ukrainians are denying, of course, that this is the case. Other parts of this article state that Zelensky had planned to carry out this attack until the CIA told him off, but Zaluzhny then did it anyway without having to listen to American advice on the issue.
Now, I've read the Wall Street Journal story, and not to impede on the credibility of Wall Street Journal journalists, I know a couple of them. I know a couple of people who work at the Wall Street Journal. They're good, solid journalists. However, their story has some holes which are a little hard to believe. The small team that the Wall Street Journal alleges seems too small, really, to handle an attack of this scale. A lot of their reporting relies on eyewitness statements, which are inherently unreliable. A lot of their reporting from the U.S. government side relies on the same anonymous U.S. officials that have repeatedly been proven to be not the most credible of sources. So I want to make it clear here, I'm not calling the Wall Street Journal a liar. I'm not saying their report is inaccurate. However, from my perspective, the report raises a lot of questions that it does not adequately answer and does not satisfactorily conclude, but it does not satisfactorily find the conclusions that it makes.
And with most of these investigations into the Nord Stream sabotage, we have mostly blown them off because they are very often poorly sourced or in some way not especially interesting and just more kindling on the fire. But what made this more relevant, I think, is the international response to this, at least in Eastern Europe. And Ukraine, of course, denied that this is true. The version that the Ukrainian government accepts is that Russia did it because they had the most reason to do it. But we have the Czech president, Petr Pavel, for example, saying that, quote, when an armed conflict is waged, it is waged not only against military objectives, but also against objectives of a strategic nature. And pipelines are a strategic goal. Wait, Czech president. And then Polish Prime Minister Donald Tusk gave his 2 cents that, quote, "To all initiators and patrons of Nord Stream 1 and 2, the only thing you should do today about it is to apologize and keep quiet." And really, they said it perfectly. Maybe Ukraine did it. Who knows? Good.
Honestly, the pod's position on the Nord Stream 2 bombing is lol lamau. Like, I'm sorry, like, even putting aside every single political concern and all the full-scale invasion and everything, it's a fossil fuel pipeline. The fact is that it is insane in the year of our Lord 2024, in the advanced stage of climate change, with above 1.5 C warming confirmed in the next over the next century. It is simply insane to continue building new fossil fuel infrastructure, not just continuing to use the fossil fuel infrastructure that exists, but continuing to build new fossil fuel infrastructure, continuing to fuel and increase the demand for fossil fuels by Earth industry. It's insane. It's suicidal. Like, the pipelines should not exist in general. They should all be right now going under dismantlement plans, and there should be transition plans in every area of the goddamn world to get us off the oil and gas teats. And you definitely shouldn't be building new ones. Like, it is utterly mind-boggling to me, especially by governments that claim, unlike, some elements and some politicians in the US, by governments that claim to believe in climate change and claim to have green energy transition plans in place and so on. Like, screw it. Yeah, that pipeline shouldn't exist, shouldn't have ever been built in the first place.
And just because we do take the leftist position here, well, it's nice to point out the leftist response in that some people, not all leftists, a minority, of course, have been very up in arms about how dare Ukraine blow up a pipeline. My dudes, a few years ago, there's a very famous book that came out called How to Blow Up a Pipeline that turned into a movie. The idea of blowing up pipelines became quite popular on the European and American left. But then when someone goes and does it, you suddenly are mad about it. Where are your principles?
Anyway, pipeline gone. Maybe Ukraine did it. Maybe someone else did. Honestly, it doesn't matter. The important part is that pipeline's gone, and Russia's fossil fuel export capacity and capability is lower than it used to be. Of course, it's not helped by Germany continuing to destroy its most potent source of energy, that is nuclear. But, at least baby steps, at least one pipeline's gone.
I'll cap off this segment with a nice thing to say about Germany and a mean thing to say about Germany. Is that I'll start with the mean thing, is that they have been very dismissive of the concerns of Eastern Europe. And that is one thing that led to this war, is that Western Europe, and Germany in particular, did not listen to the warnings that they have been given. And they've been very paternalistic about the help that they have given this whole time. However, I will say that they have been doing a very good job of shifting away from the need for Russian cheap gas. It was a drug that they have weaned themselves off of. They have been getting better with renewable energy, hydroelectric, solar, that kind of thing. And it has been taking up a much larger percentage of German energy consumption. And the Eastern European countries who have criticized Germany for the use of cheap Russian gas themselves have continued to use cheap Russian gas. And that does loom over some of these criticisms. The direct criticism was always, like I said, by bypassing intermediary states, you gave Russia more freedom of action. And that's what the actual complaint really is. But these other Eastern European countries do need to do their part of weaning themselves off of Russian fossil fuels as well. Then we're moving on to our final segment of this episode, referring to 2 laws that Ukraine has passed that have been quite important, not only to the country, but globally as well. And we'll start with the first one, which is the ratification of the Rome Statute. The Rome Statute is the treaty that forms the basis of the International Criminal Court at The Hague. Thus far, Ukraine had not ratified the Rome Statute and therefore not directly subject to the International Criminal Court. Ukraine has referred to the ICC for war crimes prosecution against Russia, but to do that, they had to give special permission to investigators to have jurisdiction over these cases. By joining the Rome Statute, Ukraine has made itself much more in line with international law, much more part of the quote-unquote international rules-based system, as they say, and has directly made itself subject to the International Criminal Court itself. Something that Russia has not done, something that the United States has not done. This is something that human rights defenders in Ukraine, civil society has been calling for, so very glad that it has happened.
It's another way for the Ukrainian government to show how unlike Russia it is, that we are not rogue actors, we are not a runaway state, that we are fully members of the international community and are obligated and interested in the upkeep of international norms such as they are. Now, if you listen to this podcast long enough, you're probably aware that I personally don't put a lot of stock into international norms coming from an international law background. But it is important to show that, at least on an aesthetic level, Ukraine cares about what the world thinks of it.
It is very much a political decision, of course. International law is kind of like Tinkerbell. It exists if you clap enough. It's a collective delusion that we all agree to, but the more that you believe in it, the more real it becomes. And the other law that was passed recently was, this one's a mouthful, on the protection of the constitutional order in the field of activities of religious organizations. We talked about this bill when it was first introduced long, long ago. The main purpose of it is to ban the activities of the Russian Orthodox Church in Ukraine, but there are some nuances there. What this law actually does is that it bans religious organizations from being headquartered in Russia or having direct connections to in subordination to Russia, and then empowers law enforcement to investigate what those ties would be. That's the more direct part of the law here, is giving law enforcement the go-ahead to investigate what those ties are. There are already laws that ban, treason. So if a priest is giving targeting coordinates to the Russians, that the law already exists to go after that guy, but going after church organizations, religious organizations who are subordinate to Russia here. We have covered the Russian church issue so many times in the past, so instead of going over it entirely, we'll just refer to our previous episodes on that. I linked to it on Twitter, for example.
TLDR, they're a KGB intelligence operation?
Yeah. The Russian Orthodox Church was founded by Stalin, run by KGB agents, and I am very literal when I say run by KGB agents. Patriarch Kirill is a KGB agent, and their activities in Ukraine for a long time have been very destructive. Even after 2014-2015, they refused to bury Ukrainian soldiers who gave their lives in the fight against Russia. They have often pursued Russian interests within the country. Their hierarchs have been directly connected to the Russian government. In many cases, when a Ukrainian village has been occupied, the primary, if not only collaborator, was the Russian Orthodox priest. This is a fifth column in the country. Now, not all of it is, and that will be important here, because really there is no singular Russian Orthodox Church in Ukraine, or as they say, the Ukrainian Orthodox Church or Ukrainian Orthodox Church Moscow Patriarchate. Names, I describe it elsewhere. Listen to the rest of our corpus. But the issue here is that there is no singular church here to investigate, because each individual community church operates under its own legal charter, its own legal instructions. So it would have to be, to enforce this law, there would have to be an investigation of every single community church that this applies to see if they specifically are connected to Russia. And because of that, I don't think this law will actually accomplish much by either the standards of the people who like the law or by the standards of the people who don't like the law. The odds that, Priest Vladimir from some random village in Dnipro Oblast is directly taking orders from Russia, probably not very high, I don't think.
Again, that has happened, and there are recorded cases of these village priests directly collaborating, usually with occupation authorities.
Yeah, like it it can be there, but it's not like there's going to be thugs breaking into every Moscow Patriarchate church in the country and saying we're closing you down now. There has to be an investigation that specific church is directly tied to Russia. That will not only take a very, very long time, but I think it will be a very difficult legal case for many of these connections to be proven. The hierarchs, of course, have long claimed they are not connected to Russia at all. There was a statement they made near the beginning of the full-scale invasion saying that they were no longer connected to Russia, with, again, some nuances there. Number one being they never actually published the document that said this, so who knows what that independence really means, even according to their own official documentation. And if you look at just the structure of Eastern Orthodox Christianity, it makes no sense. They have authority in Ukraine because the Russian Patriarchate says they have authority in Ukraine, and that in order to be independent from Russia, they basically have to claim that they no longer have the authority that they rest on. There is another Orthodox church in Ukraine called the Orthodox Church of Ukraine that is much more loyal to the country and is much larger. Especially after the full-scale invasion, most people jumped ship from the Russian church to the Ukrainian church. And the Russian church authorities still hate that. They refuse to accept that the local Ukrainian church is real. So to say that they are independent from Russia and to also say that the Ukrainian church is not real, these are two conflicting ideas. And again, because this is very complicated, I don't feel like we have the time to discuss that right now. And because I've discussed this at length in other locations, I won't get into what that means precisely, but just take this away from what I'm saying right now. To declare independence from Russia makes no sense according to their own standards. And that's just at the highest levels. But anyway, the local level stuff is what this law will really apply to. And I just don't see it making much of an impact in the short term. It'll be caught up a lot into the legal procedures. So yes, I don't see much changes in the short term. Big legal fights have had. A lot of the time, I feel like the Ukrainian authorities won't even consider it worth it to go after a specific church, and really will be looking at the continuation of the status quo, at least like 50-50 status quo of what it was before, where some of these churches that are much more blatant in the connection with Russia, here is another tool that the legal authorities have to shut them down. But in a lot of these very gray cases or cases where it's not so evident, it doesn't do much against them. So we'll see how it actually turns out in practice, but just reading the law, knowing the structure of how Orthodoxy works and the legal classifications that it has, I see it as being tricky. We'll just use the word tricky.
I think that overall, what this law is less a legal tool and more a normative one, meaning that it will simply serve as greater incentive for churches to disaffiliate and either go independent or join the Ukrainian church over time. Like you said, there's too many legal complexities for this to be a cut and dry thing.
Now, of course, there has been a lot of propaganda about this. Like I said, the law has certain detractors that I don't think are doing this correctly or in many ways even validly, have been saying that, oh, Ukraine is banning Christianity. As I just described in a very stuttered way, it seems like it will be legally challenging even to ban the literal Russian Orthodox Church, at this point, quite small church compared to Ukrainian Orthodoxy. So it's really not even doing anything against Orthodoxy. And the law very specifically says that it has nothing to do with actual religious practice. This explicitly cannot be used against any ritual, against any prayer, against anything like that is your actual religious practice. It is only meant to go after a actual organization that is based out of or directly connected to Russia, not the actual faith, just an organization connected to Russia. You can practice your faith without that organization. And really, the Ukrainian church and the Russian church, as far as religious practice, are extremely similar, with mostly the exceptions of the Ukrainian church sometimes using Ukrainian language. There's also been a heavy push by pro-Russian figures in America. Of course, this is one of the things that Tucker Carlson was hamming on about, was Ukraine banning Orthodoxy or banning Christianity, including referencing one lobbyist that, I don't know, it's worth getting to into him. Robert Amsterdam has been hired by pro-Russian oligarchs to basically spread lies about Ukrainian treatment of the church and doing it very, very poorly, like setting up stupid Twitter bots that no one actually responds to. This is not banning Christianity. This is not banning Orthodoxy. This is not restricting freedom of religion, only going after agents of Russian influence within the country. That closes off our episode for the week. If you would like to support Ukraine more broadly, you can go to our link tree for a list of resources for both giving and information. If you'd like to support Ukraine without hype, tell your friends and family about us. Like, subscribe. We are on YouTube, TikTok, all the social medias now. And our last video I posted on YouTube got quite a large number of views. I don't really do podcasts on YouTube, but apparently several thousand people did for our last episode. If you'd like to support us financially, you can go to patreon.com/Ukraine without hype and join our supporters, join our Discord server to communicate us, ask us questions. We'll ask you questions sometimes of what you want to hear. And of course, share some smaller news stories amongst ourselves. And right now, I'd like to thank our Patreon supporters. So thank you very much to Deborah Grazer, Randy McNerlin, the voices in my head are from Big Pharma, David Shepard, Giorgio, Vana Kokoratskaya, Michael Drucker, Mike Perone, Anna Karen Person, Anonymous, Barbara, Dennis Napalm, Devi, Dimitri Litvin, Etienne Soleil, James Burke, Jan, Yanara, Jenny Louise, Calvin Alberton, Kyle Smith, Marguerite, Michael Wickman, PLM, Shieldwall, Silas Frank, T. Bart, Vivek, Aiden, Alex Rochmel, Anastasia, Captain Technical, Chris Bennington, Christopher Yee, Daniel Spring, David Wall, Demetrio Munoz, Jish Taco, Emily Bavona, Evelyn, Francois, Grace Krause, Had to Laugh, Jacob Hoem, James Wise, Jared Bradley, Jerd, Julia Lindsay, Justin R., Kyle Johnson, Laura De Leon, Lori Halila, Lemonkin, Levy Grove, Marianne, Matt Miller, Melissa Kaselko, Anonymous, Noam Braun, Noam Hart, RDK, Sanjay, Scott Burry, Scott Gengris, Scott Tokiuk, Stuart Akers, Subtle Knife, Thomas Sobiek, Ursula Zolonkov, Veronica, Victoria Leontoneva, and Wandering Lens. Thank you all very much for your support. And until next week, Slava Ukraini.
Героям слава!